Greetings, fellow time travellers. Great to have you with me again as we travel through time and space together. I find personally that there's no better guide, no better true north, no better navigational aid than history. I'm maybe wrong, but it comforts me because everything is operating in cycles that repeat and repeat and repeat. And that which is happening now, versions of it have happened before. And at the very least, it's instructive to look back when exactly the same thing or something very similar has happened in the past, and just to see how it played out. And there's wisdom to be had. Not my wisdom. There's ancient wisdom. And so that's all it is. I'm just endlessly looking backwards to see if there are clues and understanding that help us, better able to contemplate what's happening. Thank you to everyone who signed up to my Patreon site. If you don't know about the site and how it works, well, there's not much to tell really. Patreon works on a subscription model, so if you join up and part with some cash, you become a member, and you can support all the podcasts that Paul and I do. You get access to lots of extra rewards and exclusive content, and mainly this subscription podcast means that the other podcast is and always will be free. From Patreon, there's a weekly vodcast which I film here at home with Paul's help. We run competitions, and we also invite members to suggest topics for specials. So there's lots going on. It's a great thriving community, getting bigger every day. So come and join. Go to patreon.com, search for me by name, Neil Oliver, and sign up. Sign on the dotted line. Okay, it's time to strap yourselves into the time machine as we set off towards the next stop in my love letter to the British Isles. Cue the music. It holds you in its grasp because it leaves you in no doubt that it's there and it's alive. It's a dynamic landscape. You don't get lulled into the sense of life just rolling softly on there. It's abrupt and visceral and in your face, dissolving and being smashed to pieces before your eyes. In this podcast, we're travelling to the Iron Age and the end of the earth. A landscape of great power and beauty. Two formidable forts, built high on dramatic cliff tops, on a rugged coastline whose shoulder is set hard against the mighty Atlantic. These ancient forts have a mystery at their heart, whose explanation gives us a profound insight into the changing world and how we live in it today. I'm stepping out across Britain to discover 100 remarkable places that have shaped you, me, and the whole world. I'm Neil Oliver, and this is my love letter to the British Isles.
Hi Neil, last week we travelled with you to mid-Glamorgan and looked into the reflections of another world. Where are we this week?
Well, today you need to get your toughest walking gear on, Paul. We're going to a place like no other. The beautiful Aran Islands, off Galway Bay on the west coast of Ireland. And it's here that two mighty Iron Age forts sit looking out to sea, and they're called Dundukha and Dundukha. This is my love letter to the British Isles, and we talk about the British Isles, and people on hearing that name, they'll have that kind of weather map picture in their heads of the long island of England, Scotland and Wales, and then the chunkier island beside of Ireland. But in reality, when you pay proper attention to the map, there are many, many islands, especially off the west coast of Scotland, but dotted all around. It is very much an archipelago. of islands, great and small. And this particular episode takes us to the Aran Islands, which is a set of 3 islands off the west coast of Ireland, out into the Atlantic. The 3 islands are Inishmore, which means the big island. It's the largest of them. And then there's Inisheer and Inishmaan. But they all sit together in a wee row. They look quite strange viewed from above. They're quite they have that sort of treeless, flat, exposed look, especially given where they sit, which is out into the Atlantic, the mighty Atlantic Ocean. If anyone remembers Father Ted and the shots of an island that were in the opening credits, that was the Aran Islands. So that landscape of flat limestone, cracked with erosion and quite desolate looking, that was one of the Aran Islands. And they have an atmosphere all of their own. And really that's part of, I think, what undercuts my love affair with the British Isles, is because as you go out into the extremities, if you like, and get out onto the islands, the variation of landscapes and atmospheres, dialects, accents, languages that you hear as you move around into the islands is part of what makes the whole place so intoxicating. So there you go, long-winded answer to your question, but we're on Inishmore, the largest of the Aran Islands off the west coast of Ireland, off the west coast of Galway.
The largest island, Inishmore, is only about 8 or 9 miles long, isn't it?
Yeah, a veritable dot on the map, really. It's small, with a quite a small population by comparison to what most people are used to.
People live there, though.
Yeah, it's a populated place, but it has a unique feeling to it, especially because, I mean, obviously, Ireland is, it's another country. The Republic of Ireland, the south of Ireland, it's another place, and you feel it. You feel that you've arrived in another destination, and then in that way of islands, when you go out onto the Aran Islands, they feel different again. In the same way that Shetland and Orkney don't feel necessarily like Scotland, they feel like Orkney and they feel like Shetland, and they have characters and atmospheres all of their own. And so it is with the Aran Islands. You go out there and you feel as if you've broken the bonds with the mainland and you've arrived somewhere else. And what we're specifically interested in, what I was taken aback by, are a couple of forts, Iron Age forts. One of them's called Dunangus, like Angus, like the name. The other one's called Dundukha, which is Irish Gaelic for the Black Fort. Dun means fort, but Dundukha is the Black Fort. So it's these 2 forts together that we're talking about today.
Do we know when the islands were first settled?
Well, the farmers and people who started claiming land there and understanding themselves as owners of property, the first of them were probably armed with stone tools, and then more of the same would have acquired bronze making technology. And so some of the work would have been done by people with bronze tools. But then during the lifetime of these forts, Dundukha and Dunangus, they were Iron Age. So the ownership of that territory sprawls across centuries and millennia. Dunangus and Dundukha are regarded as Iron Age. So you're talking about in the second half maybe of the first millennium before the birth of Christ. So, I mean, a useful figure might be, say, from 400-500 BC, and then coming up through and overlapping with the time of the birth of Jesus Christ. So, Iron Age, you might say.
The islands sit off the west coast of Ireland, hard against the Atlantic. Does that give them a distinctive look and feel?
Yeah, the Atlantic, we know we sit in we call it the North Sea, don't we, in the English Channel and such like, but in reality we're in the Atlantic with the British Isles, although it doesn't always feel like that. The island of Ireland takes the hit of the Atlantic Ocean and protects the Long Island of Britain from its presence, really, to some extent. But when you go out to the Aran Islands, out to the west, and you stand on the cliffs of the Aran Islands facing west, you're confronted with the physical reality of the Atlantic Ocean. And it looks big, and it looks intimidating, and it looks, when the wind is blowing and the surf is up and the waves are rolling in, like no other place, I would say. It's there that the Atlantic Ocean says, stop right there. It's just, it looks like it means business out there. When you're standing on the Aran Islands looking west, the waves that are rolling in, the swell that's coming towards you, hasn't touched land for 2,500 miles. I mean, the next landfall after the Aran Islands is North America. And it's unbroken Atlantic Ocean in between. So when the wind is blowing, when it's blowing from the west and those waves are rolling in towards the cliffs, you really get a sense of what the Atlantic Ocean actually means. And you start to see how it would have put the mockers on people who travelled out of the east. Everyone that arrived, I mean, for thousands upon thousands of years, people have been on the move from the east, from the Middle East and further, and coming in towards the setting sun, coming west. And for the longest time, you could just walk all the way into the British archipelago. For thousands of years, it was just a peninsula of northwestern Europe. So the first people that would have come west would have walked in dry-shod. But then obviously later, by the time of, say, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, you're talking about if people wanted to come from continental mainland Europe into the British archipelago, they would have needed to get aboard a boat, either make one or borrow one or steal one or somehow get on a boat and come across. And then when you get to the west coast of the Long Island, then you're confronted with getting across the Irish Sea. And it's at different times, sea levels varying as they have done. You know, sometimes the crossing would have been longer, sometimes it would have been shorter, depending on how deep the water was. And in any event, at the moment, the narrowest crossing between Scotland and Ireland is only 12 miles. So you can see from one to the other. So people who had come out of the east heading west would have been able to see the next landmass, which is Ireland. And then having crossed and got onto the island of Ireland, if they walked across into the west, eventually they would come to the Atlantic coastline. And then finally, you make it to the Aran Islands, and that's the end of the line. They must have kind of dropped their shoulders and thought, we're not going any further. You know, it's like High Barnet on the Northern Line. This is it. We've hit the buffers. We're not going any further now. And it has that feel of end of the line. You could sense that, without a great deal of effort, that was to wait centuries, millennia, before people were crossing the Atlantic. It's this far and no further. And not just our species. So for as long as variations on what it is to be human have been on the move, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthal people, and then us. For all of those, millennia after millennia, experiment after experiment with being human, when they reached the west of Ireland, that's it. They're not going any further without a great deal of effort.
The endeavour of our ancestors is extraordinary, isn't it? Hopping from island to island to see what's coming up round the corner.
Yeah, and there are people, I suppose, there always are, there are people who take their circumstances for granted and just accept. They reach the end of the line, they say, fine, we'll stop. But there are always those people who continue to look further, who look at the moon and think we could go there. Or they look at Mars and think, well, why don't we go there? And that aspect of human nature's evidently always been there. And on the west of Ireland, on account of the Atlantic Ocean, there would have been clues for those of an inquiring nature that there was yet more land. There are seeds and wood and items that wash up on the Atlantic coast from time to time. And, you know, if big tree trunks are coming in, for example, maybe after a big storm, you might have to ask yourself, where has that come from? Because from time to time, you know, trees have fallen into the sea off the eastern seaboard of the United States of America. And after a time, they drift and come all the way across. And people had noticed funny kinds of seeds, big seed pods and things that were coming in that weren't of native British or Irish vegetation. And some people would have looked at them and thought, that's come from land. So although they couldn't see it, and although in reality the land that they were becoming aware of was 2,500 miles away, the more inquiring of them would have known. There are stories from history from time to time of Inuit. There's at least one story of an Inuit man and woman's bodies arriving in a dugout canoe in the west of Ireland within historical times. And this would have been people that had come, you know, from the far north, wherever, you know, Greenland, wherever, and then by one means or another, they've ended up on the west of Ireland. So there would have been lots of clues when it came to the time of, say, Christopher Columbus, who for a long time before he got there was convincing himself of the possibility of heading west, and he thought he was going to hit India. Because he didn't know that there was a whole other set of continents in between, which was the Americas. But in any event, he was hearing hearsay and folklore about things, items washing ashore in the west of Ireland, which were giving people the clue that there was land out there. So there were lots of reasons to stand on the west coast of the Aran Islands, the west coast of Galway, and look out and think, there's another world out there. When and how will we reach it? But you sense, in short, out there on the west, there's a feeling of being on the edge. Because you are. And you can feel it. And the Atlantic Ocean in all its muscly presence, and the weather and the wind reminds you, you know, you've reached the edge of something. Dare you go any further, it seems to say.
But they were there and they were building.
Yes, absolutely. To get back to the subject in hand, these two Iron Age forts, and they are quite astonishing structures to behold. So you get yourself to the Aran Islands, and you get yourself out onto the Atlantic coastline, and what you confront there. The cliffs there are about 300 foot sheer into the sea. And then hiving off, cutting off a few acres is a massive grey wall of limestone masonry. Now, what you see today has been reconstructed in the Victorian era. So there were work gangs that were set to work during the Victorian period to rebuild what had been there. But all the evidence suggests that they were pretty faithful to recreating in a realistic way what had been there anyway and had simply collapsed after abandonment and with the passage of centuries and millennia. But what you're looking at is, in terms of its structural appearance, is probably what was there in the Iron Age. So you've got a curving wall that when you're standing within it, you've got your back to a 300-foot drop. And you approach Dunangus and Dundukha over a very distinctive landscape. The geologists call it karst, that's K-A-R-S-T. And it's flat, grey limestone rock. It's very level. And limestone dissolves in the presence of rainwater. So the rain will get into fractures and weaknesses in the surface. So you tend to get it splitting into quite regular shapes. So it has some of the look of a pavement. There are some stretches of it you walk across and it looks like laid paving stones. These are called grikes, G-R-Y-K-E-S. So you end up with this karst landscape broken up by grikes that looks like you're walking across a pavement. And to add to the kind of man-made look of some patches of it, some fragments of the limestone that shatter off and break off, the wind will flick them up, and some of them catch upright in these grikes. So some of it has the look of the beginnings of a wall or a boundary, as if someone has laid them in deliberately, but all the evidence makes clear that it's just a natural event.
So it's just a geological process?
It's just a geological process. You're stepping over them and walking over what looks like a paved surface. So there's quite a strange feel. There's some very hardy vegetation also establishes itself down in the shelter of these grikes. So it's quite a strange, otherworldly landscape. Very beautiful. I mean, in all weathers. I mean, whether you're out there in a howling gale with the rain driving into your face, or whether you're lucky enough to be there with a clear blue sky above and the sunshine upon it, it's very lovely. So you walk out, and eventually you come to, say, Dundukha, one of the forts, and you're confronted by this grey wall, 20 feet high, massively thick. I mean, thick enough that it's got internal staircases. On the top of it, it's wide enough for, I don't know, half a dozen people to walk abreast. It's a massive feature, and so you get in, and inside, within the area that's defined by this massive curving wall, there are the lower courses of various structures, buildings of one sort or another. But the overwhelming feeling is of, why on earth would you do this? They're a class of monument called Promontory Forts, because they appear on the edge of the land and sometimes on headlands. But in any event, when you're within it, you think, why would you go to all this trouble to build a wall 20 feet high, 10, 15, 30 feet thick, with your back to a 300-foot drop into the ocean, and inside there's nothing here? So you think of, it's like in Game of Thrones, you know, the wall that was to keep the White Walkers out. You look at this structure and you think, what on earth were they defending themselves against? Because if you were behind that wall, defended though you undoubtedly were by the wall, how long could you sustain a siege? You know, if an enemy's beyond the wall, what are you going to do? It's 300 feet down to the sea, so you're not leaving that way. And if you're completely surrounded, what is the utility of this structure? So it's very odd, and it's a very intimidating feeling that you get when you're there, because you're invited to imagine that people were defending themselves against something awful. So what's going on here on this little island? Then nearby, the clues that ultimately provide the answer are more visible. And that's when you go to Dundukha, the Black Fort. And its predicament is even more extreme, in that where Dundukha is a curving wall against a long stretch of cliff, Dundukha is on a headland. So if you imagine a headland of rock going out into the sea, and then across the neck of it is another massively built wall, completely blocking off the end of the promontory. I mean, from above it almost looks like a fingernail delineated on a long finger by this grey wall. That's what it has the appearance of. So you look at it and you think, what on earth? Why would you? It's just a barren headland. What? Supposing you are behind it, how long can you last? What are you going to do here? And it's at that point, it's about 100 feet down to the. I think it's maybe 70 or 80 feet down to the sea at that point, but it's still sheer drop. So all of it has this atmosphere of futility. You've gone to all this effort 2,500 years ago to build this wall. Why? What's it doing for you? Well, I had the great good fortune to visit these places with a lovely man who's no longer with us. He died a few years ago now. His name was Michael Williams, and he was, when I met him, he was let me get this right, he was the Professor of Earth and Ocean Sciences at the University of Ireland, based in Dublin. And he was one of these. So a lot of the time, sometimes when you meet academics, they can be quite dry when you talk to them about their specialty, or they can be very specialised in the language that they use, and it can be quite difficult to get into their heads and understand. But Mike was brilliant. He seemed to be having so much fun thinking about geology and things geological that, I'm an archaeologist, but when I was with him, he was so persuasive and convincing that for the whole time I was with him, I kind of wished I had studied geology instead, because while I was with him, it sounded like his subject was better. He was that kind of communicator. He was just terrific, larger than life, and great, very funny and self-deprecating. And within Dundukha, the Black Fort, and near the cliff edge, there are piles on a vast scale, vast quantity of great slabs of limestone. Now, some of them weigh 7 tons alone, on their own. Massive pieces of rock. They look like they've been emptied off the back of a lorry. There's hundreds and hundreds of them. And he said, what do you think of these? And I could offer no easy explanation to where they had come from. Well, he said, and he took me to the cliff edge, and he said, such is the scale of the force of the Atlantic Ocean here, that when the waves come in, the waves impact at the bottom, and then the force of the water shoots right up, and they flick off, like tiddlywinks, the top layer of limestone. And the force of the ocean is so great that it can flick a piece of stone like a tiddlywink, but weighing 6-7 tons, through the air, and then they land. And over the period of time, they have piled up. So he said, this is the force of nature that you're dealing with here. And so, in essence, what he was able to make me see was that Dunangus and Dundukha, although they appear as just walls blocking off a cliff edge, what you're looking at are the remains of complete circular forts. So what the people actually did was build massive circular stone forts in the middle of the landscape. At the time Dunangus was built, let's say, it was probably 2/3 of a mile from the cliff edge.
Wow. And
in the intervening 2,500 years, the forces of erosion are so powerful, they're eating into the Aran Islands at the rate of about maybe a foot a year, that the Atlantic Ocean has nibbled all the way back for 2/3 of a mile, maybe a mile, and has taken most of the fort. Okay, so the people didn't build on a cliff edge; they built in the middle of their territory. And then, long after they were gone, the Atlantic Ocean came for it. That's how powerful it is. So, Dunangus and Dundukha, it's one of those places in the landscape. There are others, for other reasons, where you get an absolute, you come face to face with the fact that Mother Nature, if you like, is not finished with the British Isles. You look at the map of the world, and it feels like a finished product, as though that's the world. But of course, every moment, the coastline of Britain and everywhere is being readjusted. On a micro scale, by every wave that breaks up on a beach, is shaping it again. But then on the macro scale, when it comes to the mighty power of the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere like the Aran Islands, you see the way in which the sculpting, the shaping of the British Isles is still an active event. And this island, this archipelago, is a work in progress. And if you were to come back in 1,000, 10,000 years' time, whatever, it'll all look different. I mean, for one thing, the Aran Islands will be gone. You know, the Atlantic Ocean's not going to stop eating them, and eventually it will consume the Aran Islands. Who knows how long that will take, but that force is unstoppable and ongoing.
Do you think this ongoing, relentless erosion has an impact on the psyche of the people who live here?
I suppose, yes, it would have to. Remember the very first episode, do you remember we talked about Haysborough?
Yeah.
Where the 1,000,000-year-old footprints are. Now, that was another place which, in another way, amongst many things, was this reminder of the place being remodelled all the time. You know, those footprints were revealed because erosion of the Norfolk coastline is biting chunks out of the landscape, and those footprints were revealed at a layer that had been buried for 1 million years, best part of. There, that was on the east coast. Then over on the west, in Ireland, you get another demonstration of this idea of the place being comprehensively reworked. And I think it's often the case, isn't it, that on the islands and some of the remote locations, it does manifest itself in the imaginations of the people, because you sometimes get wonderful writing, a wonderful lyrical poetry that people have been inspired to create. There's you can't go far actually on Inishmore without running across quotations from Leo O'Flaherty, who was a late 1800s, early 1900s maybe, local. He was born and raised on Inishmore, and he was a poet and a novelist. He was a proto-communist. He was one of the early part of the early uptake of the ideology of communism. An interesting character, and he wrote lines about I was born on a storm-swept rock and hate the soft growth of sun-baked lands where there is no frost in men's bones. Swift thought, the flight of ravenous birds and the squeal of hunted animals are to me reality. Now, the storm-swept rock, this idea of a place that's being battered and where life is hard, I hate the soft growth of sun-baked lands where there is no frost in men's bones. The squeal of hunted animals, the flight of ravenous birds, swift thought. These are all products of living in a challenging, hard, sometimes beautiful, without a doubt, when the sun is on it, but also a place that doesn't hesitate to show you how powerful nature can be. And to such an extent that he wants a storm-swept rock over a sun-baked land, because it's in him. And there's another writer that's popular there is a guy called John Millington Synge, I think roughly contemporary. He was a Protestant boy, posh lad from Dublin, I think, but he took ill at some point in his life, and he recuperated on the Aran Islands. He was taken there for the good of his health, and after he left, he wrote about the sort of yearning I feel towards those lonely rocks is indescribably acute, and the islands are fading already, and I can hardly realise that the smell of seaweed and the drone of the Atlantic are still moving around them. So he was, this was him going back to mainland Ireland, back to his sort of urban life, but he had been left with this sense, the drone of the Atlantic. That if you've been on an island, a small island in our part of the world, in the British part of the world, the smell, that ozone smell of the seaweed, and the usually quite comforting, but that drone of the sea, that relentless, the drone is descriptive of something that never stops, relentlessness. So although if you lie in your bed at night in the dark and you can hear the sea, it can be quite soporific and it can help you go to sleep, it's nonetheless relentless. So I think, yes, in answer to your question, I think people that live on the edge, where their landscape is being modified, if not downright preyed upon and eaten by the sea, I think it does get into their heads. I was born on a storm-swept rock and hate the soft growth of sun-baked lands where there's no frost in men's bones. I get that. I can empathise with that feeling that although it's a hard place, a challenging place, quite a cruel place, quite a cruel landscape to some extent, it's also captivating. And it holds you in its grasp because it leaves you in no doubt that it's there and it's alive. It's a dynamic landscape. You don't get lulled into the sense of life just rolling softly on there. It's abrupt and visceral and in your face, the way in which nature is at work on those landscapes. I'm always thinking about ways in which my lifespan my short lifespan is unfolding against a context of millions of years, billions of years. And there are places I find it worthwhile going to, like the dynamism of an island that is dissolving and being smashed to pieces before your eyes, that reminds you about the grand scale of the sculpting of the British Isles, and that we just exist like this year's crop of midges. We're just here for a moment, and these much bigger construction and destruction projects are underway. And you go to somewhere like the Aran Islands and you go, oh yes, there's a big picture here, isn't there?
So even the great age of this ancient fort pales into insignificance.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, that's right. It's 2,500 years old, let's say, which means it's older than Christianity, older than Islam. It's as old as Buddhism, right? You're talking about a structure that's as old as the three great faiths on the face of the earth, and yet it's just being picked apart by the forces of nature. So even something that was built so long ago and has lasted for 2,500 years is inconsequential in the face of the work of nature. You know, the relentless redesign, reworking, sculpting job that's going on all the time. Even our grandest, most ambitious structures, they just get taken.
Do we know much about the people who built the forts?
They were numerous enough that they could deploy the manpower required to make something massive. So there must have been enough people that they were able to come together for collective endeavour to create a massive fort. It may well have been the sort of place that was a central point for a tribe. You know, so a group who had secured control or dominance over a wider area would have had something like Dundukha or Dundukha or others like them as their capitals. I mean, capital is a word that's loaded with all sorts of connotations about, you know, civilization and structure of society, but it's a focal point in a landscape that everyone would have known about, and there was probably a key figure or a key family in residence there, in control of it, as well as being a statement of authority. It was probably somewhere that had defensive potential. So maybe from time to time people had to retreat into the fort and defend themselves and defend their territory. They would have been farmers. You know, we've already visited the Cage of Fields in another of the podcasts, you know, which was this massive cattle farming station. You know, the stone walls that are revealed beneath the peat bog. You know, that was the people who were working together to look after large herds of cattle. You know, that's in the Neolithic period. But subsequent to that, into the Bronze Age, into the Iron Age, you know, people would still have been growing cereal crops. So harvests might have been centralised for distribution in a place like Dundukha and Dundukha. They would have had cattle herds. You know, in times when people were cattle rustling, maybe you could bring the herds inside and protect them. But essentially, you're dealing with a farming population, hierarchical, with a chief and a chief's family, and you know, and control of a territory radiating out from them and from a central point in the landscape that was a home and a fortress to them. But it's so demonstrably the case that whatever they were and however much they felt that they owned that landscape, well, look at them now. They're gone, and nature is carefully removing every last brick and foundation of anything they ever thought worth building. That's the point. No doubt when they built Dundukha and Dundukha, they thought, you know, we're here forever. You know, look at us. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. Look what I can raise. Well, come back in a period of time that means nothing to nature, and it's just about gone. And that's probably the fate of our own grand creations and our own, the things that we are preoccupied with at the moment. Give it a couple of thousand years of nature and probably be scrubbed clean. Gone. Legions of heavily armed, well-trained Roman soldiers crossed the Channel, an invading army, bringing with it the modern world. Forms to fill in, records to keep, reports to file, and central heating. Conquerors who in turn were influenced by the British Isles and the people they found here. Next time in my love letter to the British Isles. Check out my Instagram account. It's called Neil Oliver Love Letter. And to ensure you get each new episode of the podcast as it goes live, don't forget to subscribe, write a review, and share with your friends. For further reading about these favourite destinations of mine, you could try my book. It's called The Story of the British Isles in 100 Places, and it's published by Transworld. Neil Oliver's Love Letter to the British Isles is produced by Paul Ratcliffe and Neil Oliver for Fat Belly Films. The music was composed by Malcolm Goldie. The social media producer is Oscar CFR. Additional research was conducted by Evie, Lucian, Archie and Teddy. Finance was taken care of by Catherine and Trudy. Post-production is the work of Althorpe Studios. The photography is by Neil R. and the graphics are the creation of Paul Plowman. And special thanks to the people across history who have made and continue to make these isles such an incredible place. This has been an FBF Podcasts production.